Normandy, July 1944. The rain had turned the French fields into black mud, thick enough to swallow a man's boots whole. Through the drifting fog, the growl of a panzer echoed like distant thunder. Its treads crushed broken hedgerows and charred helmets beneath tons of steel. Inside, 5 men sat wrapped in noise and fumes, confident, almost bored. For months they had rolled through Europe, unchallenged by Allied fire. American rifles pinged harmlessly against their armor. Then, in an instant, the myth cracked. A flash of light streaked from a nearby ditch, a hiss, a burst, and the panzer lurched violently. A hole no larger than a fist burned clean through its side armor. Flames clawed upward from the ammunition rack. The crew scrambled for the hatch, coughing, choking, disbelief in their eyes. A weapon they once called a toy had just pierced 100 millimeters of German steel. Word spread like wildfire across the front. The Americans had a new weapon, something small, shoulder-fired, and terrifyingly effective. And for the first time since 1939, the hunters began to feel hunted. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the world witnessed something new. A storm of movement and firepower the likes of which no army had ever seen. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was more than a tactic. It was a revolution. At its core stood the Panzerwaffe, the armored spearhead of Adolf Hitler's ambitions. In those early campaigns, the German tanks were not the heaviest or the thickest armored in Europe, but they were used with unmatched precision. Panzer IIs and IIIs raced ahead under cover of Stuka dive bombers, coordinating through radio, a technological advantage that allowed German armor to move as one, to strike before the enemy could even react. Poland fell in weeks. France in mere 6. In 1940 and 1941, as German columns rolled through the Ardennes and deep into the Soviet Union, Allied soldiers learned to fear the sight and sound of German tanks. Their silhouettes were burned into memory. The Panzer III, fast and reliable. The Panzer IV, steadily upgraded with thicker plates and a long 75 mm gun. And later, the monstrous Tiger I, whose armor could shrug off nearly anything the Allies could throw at it. The imbalance was stark. The British boys' anti-tank rifle, the French 25 mm gun, and early American 37 mm shells simply bounced off German armor at any meaningful distance. Infantrymen were left powerless, clutching weapons that might kill the crew only if they could somehow reach the tank itself, through fire, noise, and death. To many soldiers, tanks became a kind of mechanical terror, an unstoppable wall of noise and steel that crushed courage as easily as bone. In North Africa, British troops joked grimly that the only sure way to stop a panzer was to get run over by it. Yet behind that aura of invincibility, the German Panzer Corps was already evolving. As the war dragged on, new threats demanded thicker armor, heavier guns, and better protection. By 1943, the Panther and Tiger tanks embodied the height of German engineering, with frontal armor exceeding 100 mm thick, sloped at angles that could deflect shells like rain off glass. To face one head-on was to stare death in the face. For the Allies, each new German tank design forced a painful question: how to stop them without building an equally heavy machine. Infantry, scattered and mobile, needed something they could carry, something that could burn through armor at close range. But through 1942 and early 1943, that answer didn't exist. Allied soldiers used sticky bombs, Molotov cocktails, even improvised satchel charges. These desperate measures demanded suicidal bravery. Many didn't survive long enough to see whether their efforts worked. Reports from the front grew increasingly desperate. In Tunisia, in Sicily, in the hedgerows of France, tank sightings often meant retreat. The Allies had tanks of their own, Shermans, Churchills, Grants, but tank-to-tank combat was unpredictable, and infantry units caught without armor support were easy prey. Commanders pleaded for a solution, a weapon light enough for one man to carry, yet powerful enough to destroy a tank. A weapon that could restore balance to the battlefield. And quietly, in laboratories and workshops across the Atlantic, American engineers began to build exactly that. By 1942, Allied command understood that tanks alone could not win the war. On every front, from the deserts of North Africa to the snow of the Eastern Front, Infantry needed a way to stand against armor. Reports poured in from soldiers who had watched their bullets spark uselessly off German steel, their grenades roll harmlessly under tracks. The United States Ordnance Department had already experimented with rocket technology in the late 1930s, but it was a concept still in its infancy. The turning point came when Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Ewell, working at Aberdeen Proving Ground, combined two existing ideas: a small, fin-stabilized rocket and a simple shoulder-fired launch tube. The result was crude, a welded steel pipe 54 inches long with a wooden grip and wire trigger, but when tested against armor plate, the rocket's shaped charge warhead punched a molten hole straight through. Engineers were stunned. Here, at last, was a weapon that could melt through heavy steel by focusing explosive energy into a narrow jet, a principle known as the Monroe effect. They called it the M1 rocket launcher. Soldiers called it something else. Its long tubular shape reminded one officer of a musical instrument, and the nickname stuck: Bazooka. When the weapon entered service in 1942, few realized how profoundly it would alter modern combat. Early versions fired a 2.36-inch rocket capable of penetrating around 75 millimeters of armor, just enough to threaten the German Panzer IVs then dominating the field. For the first time, ordinary infantrymen could challenge a tank without sacrificing themselves in the attempt. The first combat tests came in North Africa during the Tunisia campaign. American GIs, often improvising under fire, aimed their new weapons at German and Italian tanks and succeeded. Reports filtered back of armored vehicles destroyed at close range, sometimes with a single hit. British forces quickly requested shipments. Soviet engineers studied captured examples. The weapon's simplicity, a pipe, a battery, and a shaped charge, made it both deadly and easy to reproduce. Still, the early bazookas were far from perfect. Moisture, battery failure, and unstable rocket propellant plagued the first models. In the mud and chaos of frontline warfare, a misfire could mean death. But innovation moved fast. By 1943, improved versions, the M9 and later M9A1, featured better sights, sturdier wiring, and detachable tubes for easier transport. Most importantly, the new rockets could burn through nearly 100 millimeters of armor under ideal conditions. Meanwhile, the Germans took notice. Captured bazookas from North Africa and Italy were reverse-engineered, leading to the development of the Panzerschreck, a heavier, 88 millimeters launcher capable of even greater penetration. Ironically, German engineers had borrowed the weapon that would soon terrify their own tank crews. As the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord in 1944, thousands of bazookas were distributed to infantry units. Each squad trained to use them in ambushes, from behind hedgerows, from ruined houses, from ditches just meters from tank treads. Soldiers learned to wait, to hold their fire until the moment the tank exposed its vulnerable side or rear. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, the humble bazooka had evolved from a field experiment into a battlefield equalizer. And within weeks, German panzer crews, once the most feared men in Europe, would find themselves hunted through the villages and hedgerows of France. The weapon that began as a pipe and a spark would ignite a new kind of warfare, where courage, precision, and timing mattered more than tonnage of steel. The technological angle, the science of armor defeat. Every war breeds innovation, but few inventions shifted the balance of power as suddenly as the bazooka. The key was not brute force but physics. The bazooka's rocket carried a shaped charge, a hollow cone of explosive lined with copper. When it detonated, the energy of the explosion was focused into a molten jet, traveling at nearly 10 kilometers per second. This jet didn't explode the armor. It melted through it, forcing white-hot metal fragments to ricochet inside the tank. The principle, simple yet devastating, allowed a soldier weighing 150 pounds to destroy a machine weighing 50 tons. The first time Allied field tests confirmed penetration through 80 millimeters of hardened steel, commanders realized the ground war had changed forever. Armor thickness was no longer absolute protection. German engineers, initially dismissive, soon understood the danger. Field reports described holes cut through side plates, as if by a gas torch. The myth of invulnerability that had defined the Tiger I and Panther began to erode. Every new weapon that forced an adaptation in design slowed production, drained resources, and chipped away at the Reich's industrial advantage. The bazooka's technology was as psychological as it was physical. It reminded every panzer crew that even perfection could bleed. The human angle courage in the dirt. For the men who carried it, the bazooka was both a miracle and a burden. It required a two-man team, a gunner and a loader, working in complete coordination under fire. They had to crawl within 50 to 75 yards of a tank that could annihilate them with a single shell. Every launch meant exposure. The backblast lit up their position like a flare, and within seconds the tank's machine guns would rake the area. Private Harold Burgett of the 30th Infantry Division recalled in his memoirs, "You don't hear the tank until it's close. A deep rumble in the ground, like thunder rolling under your stomach. You take aim, hold your breath, and hope the rocket doesn't misfire. When it hits, the explosion doesn't sound big, but you feel it. You feel the armor give." In the hedgerows of Normandy, bazooka teams became silent predators, lying still in the mud for hours, waiting for a shadow of a turret to appear through the fog. Each success came at enormous risk. Many gunners never fired twice. Yet for those who survived, the weapon became a symbol of power restored. A way for the infantryman to strike back against a machine that once ruled the battlefield without fear. It wasn't just a weapon. It was defiance made tangible. The leadership angle, miscalculation, and realization. Among German commanders, the first bazooka reports were met with skepticism. The Wehrmacht's technical departments had long maintained that Allied infantry lacked effective anti-tank firepower. Their assessments, written in the confident tone of men who had never faced a bazooka themselves, claimed that no shoulder weapon can penetrate the armor of a Panzer IV or Tiger at combat range. But as 1944 unfolded, that arrogance began to crumble. Reports from Normandy, St. Lo, and Corentin told a different story. Platoons losing tanks to small, hidden teams at ranges previously considered impossible. Armor was being pierced at 50 yards, even less. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received dispatches describing tanks destroyed by handheld rockets. He dismissed the first as exaggeration until photographic evidence arrived. Panzer IVs with small, circular holes punched cleanly through side armor, burn marks spreading outward. The realization forced a shift in German tactics. Tank units were ordered to travel with increased infantry support, to avoid close quarters, and to maintain constant scanning of terrain for ambush positions. But the reality of the European battlefield, narrow lanes, thick hedgerows, and urban ruins, made those orders nearly impossible to follow. The arrogance of leadership had underestimated the inventiveness of the enemy, and the price would be paid in fire and steel. As the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, the battlefield of Europe was no longer dominated by heavy armor alone. In every village, in every forest road, infantrymen now held the power to halt an armored advance. And for the panzer crews who had once believed themselves untouchable, a new fear began to creep in with every mile traveled. The enemy's perspective, when steel became fragile. By the summer of 1944, German panzer divisions had grown used to commanding the battlefield. They were the mailed fist of the Wehrmacht, the weapon that had carried Germany from the Polish plains to the gates of Moscow. Tank crews were trained to trust their armor implicitly. Inside their steel compartments, they felt separate from the chaos of war, observers rather than participants. But that illusion began to die in the hedgerows of Normandy. Reports from Panzer Lehr Division and 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, told of tanks destroyed at close range by what appeared to be small shoulder-fired weapons. The holes were precise, circular, no larger than a coin, but inside, devastation. Melted wiring, detonated ammunition, crews burned alive in seconds. In one after-action report from St. Lo, a German officer wrote, "The first explosion we thought was a mine. The second came from the side, impossible. No artillery, no aircraft. Just silence, then fire." The enemy was adapting faster than expected. Bazooka teams, hidden in barns, shell craters, and hedgerows, could strike before a tank could even traverse its turret. Every ruined village, every narrow lane became a potential death trap. Panzer crews began riding with hatches open, ready to jump clear. Some welded makeshift skirts of spare track links or sandbags onto their sides, desperate for protection. Others refused to enter confined areas without infantry clearing the route first. The aura of unstoppable strength, the psychological armor of the German tank corps, had been pierced as surely as their steel plating. The psychological angle, fear in both directions. The bazooka didn't just change tactics, it changed emotions. For the Germans, fear took root inside the machine. Tankers began to speak of the invisible enemy, a faceless soldier who could appear from a ditch and erase them in seconds. The deep thud of a rocket launch, once unheard of, now froze entire convoys. Crews learned to dread the sudden hiss that meant their world was about to erupt. For the Americans, the weapon was empowerment. A squad with 2 bazookas could stop a column of tanks if they played it right. Yet the fear never left their side. To use the bazooka effectively meant waiting until the tank was close enough to smell the exhaust. Soldiers described the experience as standing in front of a moving train with only a matchstick. The battlefield became a contest of nerve: who would move first, who would flinch. Courage and terror existed in equal measure on both sides. The moral angle: the machine loses its supremacy. From the beginning of the war, industrial power had defined dominance. The Panzer, the Tiger, the Panther, all symbols of human ingenuity forged into machines of death. But by late 1944, the battlefield had begun to favor simplicity. The bazooka was not a masterpiece of engineering. It was crude, cheap, and built in the thousands. This shift carried a deeper moral symbolism. The bazooka represented the democratization of destruction, power returning to the individual soldier. No longer could a nation rely solely on giant machines to impose its will. A single man, hidden and patient, could change the course of a battle. For German command, it was a bitter revelation. Their tanks had been built not just for war, but for ideology, the embodiment of strength, precision, and superiority. To see them destroyed by a tube that cost less than a set of tank tracks was more than tactical humiliation. It was philosophical defeat. For the Allies, the bazooka became a symbol of balance. Proof that no war machine was beyond reach, that innovation and courage could break even the hardest armor. The war had entered a new phase. No longer would armor guarantee survival. In the ruins of France and the forests of the Ardennes, tank crews whispered of an unseen foe, and infantrymen carried on their shoulders the weapon that had rewritten the rules of modern combat. The stage was now set for the confrontation that would define this shift, the moment when the bazooka's full potential was unleashed in battle, and the legend of German armor met its reckoning in fire and smoke. July 11, 1944. The hedgerow country south of St. Lo had become a graveyard of machines. The air smelled of fuel, soil, and cordite. In every field, rusting hulls of Shermans and Panzer IVs lay blackened, half buried in the mud. It was a landscape of ambushes, a maze of narrow lanes, earth embankments, and dense foliage where visibility was measured in yards, not miles. At dawn, rain began to fall again, a steady drizzle that turned the dirt into thick paste. Along one farm track, Company E, 134th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 35th Division moved cautiously forward. The men were exhausted. For days, they'd been pinned by German armor from Panzer Lehr Division, whose tanks prowled the hedgerows like predators. In one of those squads crouched Corporal James Kessler and his loader, Private Paul Rivers, both carrying an M1 Bazooka with 4 rockets between them. They'd already lost 2 friends that morning when a Panzer IV ambushed their platoon near a barn. Now, as they pressed through a gap in the hedge, Kessler heard it, the deep, rolling rumble of a tank engine idling just beyond the rise. He gestured. Silence fell. The men hit the ground. Through a slit in the leaves, the dark shape emerged. A Panzer IV, its 75mm gun swinging slowly across the field. The German crew had no idea they were being watched. They believed their armor made them untouchable here. Kessler steadied his launcher, the tube slick with rain. The target was close, too close. Rivers whispered the range. 50 yards. The rocket hissed from the tube with a trail of white smoke. It struck the tank's right side, just behind the road wheel. For half a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the armor buckled inward, and fire erupted from the hatches. The crew didn't even have time to escape. The explosion was contained, focused, a shaped charge doing its deadly work. Kessler reloaded, hands shaking. A second Panzer turned its turret toward them. Its cannon barked. The shell missed by inches, showering earth over the team. The loader screamed, deafened, but the corporal fired again. Another rocket, another flash, another steel giant burning in the rain. Witnesses later said the fight lasted less than 2 minutes. 2 bazooka rounds, 2 tanks destroyed. A balance of terror rewritten before their eyes. Word of the ambush spread rapidly. Across the Norman countryside, infantry platoons began to repeat the tactic, short-range ambushes, striking at weak points, using hedgerows as cover. In the days that followed, dozens of German tanks were destroyed not by artillery or aircraft, but by men on foot carrying weapons that weighed less than 20 pounds. The bazooka had become more than a tool. It was a signal that the battlefield now belonged as much to the soldier in the mud as to the man in the turret. For the German crews, the psychological shock was immediate. Tank commanders who once advanced with confidence now hesitated at every turn. Each hedgerow concealed not just rifles and mines, but the possibility of instant annihilation. That same week, Allied intelligence intercepted radio messages from German units requesting emergency side armor and infantry escorts for every tank column. The myth of invincible armor was gone. The hunters were now the hunted. The war's momentum had shifted, but this was only the beginning. As summer gave way to autumn, the panzers would face their greatest test yet. Not in the fields of Normandy, but in the frozen forests of Belgium, during the desperate gamble known as the Battle of the Bulge. And there, in snow and silence, the bazooka would prove itself once more. December 19, 1944. The Ardennes forest was buried beneath snow and smoke. The German offensive, Hitler's last gamble, Operation Walk am Rhein, had smashed through the Allied line with brutal speed. Over 2,000 tanks and assault guns, Panthers, Tigers, King Tigers, rolled through Belgium, their treads grinding frozen roads into shards of ice. The surprise was total. American units were scattered, cut off, outgunned. For days, German armor advanced unopposed. Villages like Saint-Vith, Clairvaux, and Bastogne fell into chaos. But as the offensive pushed west, the terrain began to turn against them. Narrow roads, dense forests, and brutal winter fog. Tanks could no longer maneuver freely. Every turn, every bend in the road became a choke point, and waiting there, hidden in the snow, were men armed with bazookas. In one such ambush near Elsenborn Ridge, a handful of American engineers from the 2nd Infantry Division waited in silence. They could hear the panzers before they saw them. Engines grinding, metal tracks squealing. The ground trembled. One soldier, Sergeant William Morris, recalled later, "It was like hearing the earth breathe. You knew death was coming, but you stayed still, because if you moved, everyone died." Through the mist, 3 Panther tanks appeared in column formation. The lead tank crept forward, its guns scanning the treeline. Morris gave the signal. 4 bazookas fired almost simultaneously. 2 rockets missed, 1 bounced off the sloped front plate, but the 4th struck low, under the turret ring. A gout of flame erupted as the Panther halted mid-turn, its crew scrambling out into the snow, engulfed in smoke. The 2nd tank tried to reverse, only to hit an icy slope and stall. Another rocket struck from the flank. Within seconds, both tanks were burning. The forest glowed orange against the white snow. Scenes like this repeated across the Ardennes. American infantry, often isolated and undersupplied, turned every road and village into a trap. Bazooka teams, paratroopers, and engineers worked in pairs, firing from windows, barns, foxholes, vanishing before the panzers could respond. German commanders, already pressed for fuel, began to lose their nerve. Reports reached headquarters describing entire platoons halted by infantry with rocket tubes. In desperation, the Wehrmacht ordered the attachment of panzer grenadiers to every armored column, but it was too late. The speed and confidence that had defined Blitzkrieg were gone. The offensive slowed, then stalled completely. In Bastogne, surrounded American forces, the 101st Airborne Division, used bazookas to destroy enemy tanks at point-blank range during night attacks. A paratrooper from Easy Company later described firing at a Tiger I as it rolled through the fog. You couldn't see the markings, just the shadow. I fired at the noise. The rocket hit the turret ring, and the whole thing lit up like a furnace. That moment, repeated hundreds of times across the Ardennes, marked a symbolic reversal. The weapon Germany had once mocked, a small, crude pipe born in an American lab, had become the equalizer that froze their last great armored assault. By early January 1945, the snow was littered with the wrecks of Tigers, Panthers, and King Tigers, machines that had once been invincible, now gutted by weapons no heavier than a rifle. When the German offensive finally collapsed, Allied intelligence conducted a study on tank losses in the Ardennes. The findings were startling. A significant portion had been destroyed not by airstrikes or artillery, but by handheld anti-tank weapons at ranges under 100 yards. The myth of armored supremacy was over. From Saint-Lô to Bastogne, the story was the same: courage, ingenuity, and a 2.36-inch rocket launcher had turned the tide of ground warfare. The battlefield no longer belonged to steel giants alone. It belonged to the men who dared to stand in front of them. The flames of the Ardennes faded with the winter, but their meaning would echo across the armies of the world. The German High Command now faced an impossible truth. Their era of armored invincibility had ended, and a new age of warfare had begun. One defined by mobility, precision, and the power of the individual soldier. January 1945. The snows of the Ardennes melted into rivers of mud and twisted steel. Across Europe, the wrecks of German armor, once symbols of unstoppable power, lay burned and abandoned. The Allies pressed eastward, their tanks advancing through fields once dominated by the iron thunder of panzers. But it wasn't just the armies that had changed. It was the philosophy of war itself. For the first time in military history, infantrymen had the power to stop a tank. That single shift reshaped the entire doctrine of 20th century warfare. In 1940, the tank was king, the spearhead of blitzkrieg. It was the embodiment of speed, shock, and domination. A single Tiger I could paralyze a company of riflemen, its 88mm gun turning villages into dust. The psychological impact alone often decided battles before they began. But by 1944 to 45, that aura of invincibility had shattered. The introduction of portable anti-tank weapons, the American Bazooka, the German Panzer, and later the British PIAT, transformed the battlefield into a chessboard of ambush and counter-ambush. Suddenly, every ruined street, every forest ridge, every hedgerow could conceal a weapon capable of destroying armor worth thousands of men's lives and millions of Reichsmarks. The U.S. Army quickly recognized the shift. Reports from the European and Pacific theaters were unanimous. The bazooka was no longer an experiment, it was a necessity. Production skyrocketed. By the war's end, more than 450,000 launchers and 15 million rockets had been manufactured. Training manuals were rewritten, and every infantry platoon was issued at least 2 launchers. Generals who once measured victory in divisions of tanks now spoke of combined arms tactics, where infantry, artillery, armor, and air support worked in precise coordination. No tank, no matter how thick its armor, could survive alone. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Germany, captured engineers examined the devastating simplicity of the American weapon. The Panzerfaust, directly inspired by the bazooka's design, had become the Wehrmacht's last line of defense, so cheap and effective that even teenage soldiers in the Volkssturm could use it to disable Allied Shermans at close range. The technology had completed a brutal circle. What began in an American lab had returned to Europe, evolved in German hands, and then reshaped warfare on both sides. After the war, the lessons were immediate. The Soviet Union, watching closely from the ruins of Berlin, mass-produced its own variant, the RPG-2, which would evolve into the RPG-7, one of the most widespread weapons on Earth. From the jungles of Vietnam to the streets of Fallujah, its lineage could be traced directly back to the humble 2.36-inch M1 Bazooka. But beyond strategy and engineering, there was something deeper, a psychological revolution. The bazooka had leveled the battlefield. In every war before it, armored vehicles defined dominance. Soldiers were trained to fear tanks, to hide, to retreat, to call artillery. Now, one man, crouched in a trench or a ruined farmhouse, could face down a machine that once symbolized invincibility. That shift in courage, in mindset, was as significant as any tactical breakthrough. A British observer at the time wrote, "We have given the infantryman back his pride. No longer does he look at the tank as a god of war, but as prey." This new reality didn't just end the era of armored supremacy, it redefined the human role in mechanized warfare. It proved that innovation, not size, decided battles. That courage, not machinery, could rewrite history. And as the Allies crossed the Rhine, with German tanks burning behind them, one truth stood clear above the smoke. The age of the unstoppable Panzer was over, and in its place, the age of the soldier had begun. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the war's machines lay still, but the ideas they birthed were only beginning to move. Among them, the bazooka stood out not as the largest or most powerful weapon of World War II, but as one of its most transformative. In the ashes of Europe, every major army on Earth studied its design. For the United States, the experience was a revelation. The 2.36-inch launcher, though revolutionary, had already reached its limits by the end of the war. German tanks had evolved beyond its penetration range, forcing engineers to dream bigger. By 1950, the U.S. introduced the M20 Super Bazooka, a 3.5-inch version capable of defeating 280 millimeters of armor, nearly triple its predecessor's power. It entered combat during the Korean War, where American soldiers faced Soviet-built T-34-85 tanks used by North Korean forces. Once again, infantrymen who might have been crushed under treads in 1941 now stood their ground. At Ozen and Seoul, bazooka teams ambushed advancing tanks at close range, halting armored spearheads that threatened to overrun Allied lines. But while the United States refined its rocket launcher, the Soviet Union learned faster and built broader. From captured German and Allied technology, Soviet engineers created the RPG-2 in the late 1940s. It was simpler, lighter, and easier to mass-produce than any Western equivalent. Within years, its successor, the RPG-7, would become the symbol of anti-tank warfare for half the world. This was the bazooka's true legacy: democratization of firepower. The same principle that gave an American infantryman in Normandy the power to destroy a panzer would soon empower guerrilla fighters in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and the Middle East. Where once heavy armor guaranteed dominance, now even the smallest resistance could challenge tanks, trucks, and helicopters with a weapon that cost a fraction of its target's value. Through the 1960s and 70s, the concept evolved further: recoilless rifles, guided missiles, and disposable launchers like the M72 Law and AT-4 all owed their existence to the technological DNA of the original 1942 bazooka. Its influence was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. The world's military strategists began to understand a new truth: mobility and precision would always defeat mass and armor. During the Cold War, tank designers responded with sloped armor, reactive plating, and composite materials, each innovation born in direct response to that simple shoulder-fired rocket invented in Aberdeen. But no matter how thick the armor became, engineers on the other side built a stronger warhead. It was an endless duel: steel versus chemistry, weight versus agility. And through that arms race, one idea endured: the infantryman would never again be helpless. By the time the 20th century closed, the bazooka's spiritual descendants had fought on nearly every continent. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq, from Afghan caves to African cities, soldiers and insurgents alike carried weapons that traced their lineage to a 54-inch steel pipe from 1942. The weapon had outlived its inventors, its original purpose, and even its name. Yet its echo remained in every shoulder-fired launcher, every anti-tank missile, every urban firefight where courage and timing still meant everything. The bazooka was more than a weapon. It was a statement that no empire of steel is invincible, and that innovation can give even the smallest soldier the power to shape history. The war ended, the guns fell silent, and the smoke drifted from Europe's broken cities into the quiet of history. But somewhere in that silence, the echo of a rocket still lingered. The bazooka was born not out of hatred, but necessity, a creation of desperation and ingenuity. It was a weapon built by men who understood that technology alone would not win the war, that courage needed a tool worthy of its will. Changed everything. The tank, once a symbol of dominance, of invulnerability, was humbled by a single man with a tube on his shoulder. In that moment, the story of warfare shifted from machines to minds. Power was no longer about how much steel one could forge, but how cleverly one could use it. In every battlefield since, that balance between might and innovation has defined history. From the shaped charge experiments of the 1930s to the precision-guided missiles of the 21st century, the lineage is unbroken. A straight line drawn through decades of conflict, progress, and sacrifice. But beneath all the technology, one truth remains unchanged. War is still fought by people, tired, cold, frightened, relying not just on weapons, but on the thin courage that holds their hands steady. For the American soldier crouched behind a hedgerow in Normandy, the bazooka was more than a piece of equipment. It was a promise that he was no longer powerless, that even against the roar of panzer engines and the glare of steel, he could stand his ground. And in that small act, in the defiance of one soldier against a machine, lies the enduring legacy of the bazooka. It reminds us that history is not only written by those who command armies, but by those who dare to resist them. That every innovation, born from necessity, carries both the power to destroy and the possibility to protect. And that, sometimes, the weapon that changes the world isn't the biggest or the loudest, but the simplest one, fired by the steady hands of a man who refuses to surrender.